Good evening, everybody. I'm Jacob Winograd, host of the Biblical Anarchy podcast here at the Christian Institute, here for another live stream here in the green room. And I'm joined tonight by C.J. Sorry, is it Engel? Is that the right pronunciation?
Engel,
Engel?
yeah.
Something like that?
Yep, that
Yeah,
works.
Engel, yeah. I usually remember
I was
to
on that.
ask
Yeah.
before, but no, it's all right. I have a last name that's also people get like because they'll go, is it Winograd or is it Winograd? And so it's just one of those things. But yeah, I'm joined tonight by C.J. C.J. is the host of the Chronicles Magazine Podcast, and to someone that people have recommended that I talk to and have a conversation with. We're both, I guess, in this sort of like broader, right wing sort of dissident camp that exists that contains a lot of different figures. Actually, this is sort of funny that we scheduled this before I had my conversation last week with Stephen Wolf, who I see actually referencing you a lot in a lot of the things that he tweets and says. So there's a lot of crossover in these different camps and stuff. To start out, I just wanted to give you a chance to introduce yourself, just explain a little bit about your background for the audience, and then we'll get into the conversation.
Yeah, well, the most interesting things about me related to what we're talking about are probably just my involvement in the so-called blogosphere, but also various websites and outlets over the years. I've been having these types of discussions for a long time. I was just talking to my wife, and it's astonishing that it's been 12 years since I first started reading the Mises Institute and all that stuff because of Ron Paul, in 2011. So that's kind of my introduction to everything related to politics and theory and current events and all that stuff. So I have a very deep root in that whole world. So I still am good friends with a lot of the Mises guys, and I kind of came up from a typical neoconservative background, which is basically sort of a default. If you're a Christian evangelical, for the most part, you're going to be a Bush type conservative, so-called conservative. Probably not conservative, probably not the best way to describe them. But in any case, libertarianism, which was a refreshing solution after the crisis in Iraq and the financial crisis and all that stuff. Ron Paul really hit the nail on the head in regards to foreign policy and Federal Reserve central banking as being the most important issues of our time. So I still hold those issues near and dear to my heart. But over the course of time, I began to transform into other avenues of thinking, and sort of it's been, so I'm still really friendly with people like the Mises Institute, but I have much more of a Chronicles Magazine paleoconservative Paul Gotfried disposition at the moment.
Yeah, I actually got to meet and listen to Paul Gotfried at a Mises Institute event. They've been doing more of those lately, and they did one in my county. So I went with actually Doug Stewart, who's the CEO of the Libertarian Christian Institute, and then some of the Mises caucus from the Libertarian Party people in the area. And so there was a bunch of people speaking, but Paul was one of them. Good guy, very very friendly, very knowledgeable. Although he then started to wax a little bit about his disagreements with libertarians, and so we got to talk a little bit about that. Yeah, so I wanted to give you a chance to kind of lay out the groundwork. This in terms of what your views are, because it is, sometimes these conversations can be difficult, sort of like the one I had last week with Stephen Wolf. It's like when I talk with people who either used to be libertarians or who were like paleocons, and so we have some diverging views. Like it's easy, I think, probably for both sides, for lack of a better way to phrase it, to sort of like, make assumptions about the other side, be like, oh, so like I could be like, you disagree with libertarianism, so like I could describe certain views to you, and I'm a libertarian, so you could ascribe certain views to me. But it's like it's better to try to like realize that even within libertarianism and within paleoconservatism, or whatever you want to call it, within the right wing right now, there's a lot of varying views, and so sometimes it's just important to get that out on the table and see where someone's coming from. It's funny you said people growing up a Christian, at the time that a lot of us were growing up, you'd be, a neocon, Bush Jr. type. Uh, what's funny is I was raised in that environment myself, but because I became very like red pilled on American interventionism from a young age, and I didn't know that you could be right wing and anti war. I basically fell hard into the left, and so I actually was kind of a eventually I sort of fell into the Bernie Sanders camp because that's where a lot of the dissident left wingers who were anti-imperialism ended up, and so I was there for a while till Trump got elected and broke the left, and then I kind of went on a political sojourn, discovered sort of like long after the moment had happened, Ron Paul and the Mises Institute and all that, and got my economic education, figured out Austrian economics and all that, and became an Austria libertarian. So that's a little bit of where I'm coming from. I've been all over the place. I saw also in one of your bios, you sort of, I don't know if it was on Twitter or somewhere else, you described yourself as a reformed Catholic, but also kind of like uh, Anglican Lutheran, which I
Yeah.
find to be very interesting because I've sometimes used similar ways to describe my theology. So like I consider myself reformed. I'm I go to a non-denominational, essentially, Baptist, so low church reformed uh congregation and pastor in that church. But I find a lot of within church tradition, even in a lot in Catholicism, that I find valuable, and that also I think isn't in contradiction with Reformed theology, which is sometimes hard to have that conversation with some people who call themselves Reformed because they can have an allergy to those things. So I'm kind of curious what your thoughts are there.
Yeah, well, I wasn't expecting to talk theology, but my background, well, like everybody else, I mean, if you're an evangelical neoconservative, you're going to be sort of a dispensationalist, and I grew up and still live in California. And so this is like Calvary Chapel land. So it's very dispensational, pre-mill, like Left Behind series kind of stuff. So, I left that, decades ago, 15 years ago, which is very typical of people in our generation to kind of look beyond the horizons of the 20th century and some of its theological developments. So I'm not unique in that way, but I did go down the pathway of Calvinism and Reformed theology. And the further back in time, the more you begin to have a grasp of, I guess I would call it historical consciousness or historical awareness. I began to appreciate,
Yeah.
the Catholic faith, and people when they say that, obviously they distinguish between big C and small C Catholic, but I really mean it in a much more profound historical way. That like the Catholic faith is my faith, and I consider the post Trent Catholic Church as sort of a long, intense and sad deviation from the Catholic faith. And so I consider like myself a pre-Trent, Catholic, and that's sort of, I think, the ethos of the Reformation. At least some of it. There were aspects of the Reformation that were much more forward-looking and radical, and I think people like Martin Luther really had a hard time with that. But I do have much more of an old Reformation theology that I consider to be true Catholicism in a meaningful way. I've also distanced myself theologically from some of the tendencies of what I would call the precisionist strain of Reformed theology, or the Puritan strain. And that allows me to be much more historically aware and appreciative of tradition and things like that, which is how I see camps like Anglicanism and Lutheranism.
Yeah.
And I can get into the details and weeds on that, but I do have much more of a pre-Trent Catholic mind. I do have much more of an Augustinian medieval mind. And so I found solace in the Anglican divines like Richard Hooker, or John Davenant, or Lancelot Andrews, people like that, and then also some of the more traditionalist Lutherans as well. So that's kind of where I'm at, theologically. But it's interesting to me, and then there's the interesting conversations of, is there a crossover between some of the theological ressourcement, the theological retrieval, and some of the political retrieval that we might be talking about today?
Sure, yeah, well, and a lot of that's very much what I talked to Wolf about last week, is that he was kinda,
Mhm.
reclaiming a lot of that medieval thought as well, classical thinkers and sort of like trying to retrieve sort of some of that lost wisdom that people don't recognize. And yeah, a lot of what you're speaking of theologically, although that's not the main focus of what I wanted to talk to you about, it's interesting because I'm very much coming from a similar place where I there's a lot about Reformed theology I like, but I want to have a purchase on historical Christianity. I don't
Mhm.
want to take the position. And I think that there's plenty of Reformed Christians who want to do that as well. Like I remember James White talking once on his show about how like if we're if we're too anti-Catholic, we will act like Christianity didn't exist until 500 years ago, because for over a millennia, people who were Christian were Catholic and Catholic were Christian. They didn't have a distinction, and so we need to be able to go back through the ages and see. I think the visible and invisible church throughout all of that, and not and although there's certainly errors, I think that cropped up within Catholicism, that doesn't mean that that there was nothing there that was also true and valuable. So yeah, that's all good and well and interesting. So in terms of what I think people wanted you and I to talk about, which is more, although I mean theology touches everything, so I'm sure we'll reference that here or there, but more on the political side in terms of libertarianism, and I've had a lot of dialogue with uh, critics of libertarianism, including people who abandoned libertarianism, or like, there was a lot of people who were actually like in my circles, like in the Libertarian Party in the Mises Caucus, who left and they were calling themselves post-libertarian, or later they called themselves Praxian. So it's like Matt Erickson, Pete Quinones, and I'm friendly with all of them. I've had good conversations with them, and so I kind of understand their arguments and perspectives. But I guess first question I'd ask, because although I understand their criticisms, I still think libertarianism is good and true and generally something that Christians should be in favor of. Although there's there's some wiggle room and gray area. I mean, there's certainly some aspects of libertarianism in terms of the broader movement that I think are wrong and need changed or correction. And I do think libertarianism needs to be in a proper context, because I don't think that libertarianism is enough for a society to be good. It's more like the absolute bare minimum to start out with is proper. I think property rights are somewhat of a foundation for any good society. Like if you had a Christian society that didn't respect property rights, I think there'd be a problem there. But what are your thoughts in terms of libertarianism? How you define it, and what general questions or concerns started to, you know, that you encountered that led to you thinking that it needed to be, no longer the political ideology that you think is either true or that you would ascribe to.
I think the best definition of libertarianism is it's the view that any initiation of force against a person or his property should be illegal, and it can be responded to with force. I think the that would be the non-aggression principle. I think that's the most basic understanding of libertarianism, and I think it's the best. That makes libertarianism very thin. There was a debate years ago about thick versus thin, and I think the
Yep.
best definition of libertarianism is basically that, and it's built on the idea that there's a certain relation that an individual man has with his property, and what are the logical derivatives of that principle. And I think that's basically what libertarianism is you start at the very beginning of things and you extrapolate from there logically. So libertarianism is a very logically concise. It's extremely logically it's almost logically perfect. I mean, you take everything from that first principle and you sort of go deductively down through the steps, and you can determine what is an inappropriate use of force and what is an appropriate use of force, and you can delineate between those based on that first principle. It solves everything. It solves all the problems of questions about how should political agents act, how should political figures act. And if you're an anarcho-capitalist, you come to the conclusion that the very essence of a political agent, in as much as he's participating in the government, which has a monopoly on force, therefore, by first principles, that is illegitimate and immoral, and therefore, you have the logical conclusion of a stateless society. And I think that's the best description libertarianism, I do think that anarcho-capitalism is the best and purest application of libertarian principles out there. I think that
Yeah.
like the minarchist position is I don't think it's, if you want to start at ground, if you want to start with libertarian principles, then I don't think minarchism is defensible. So I think that the anarcho-capitalism is the perfect application of libertarian first principles, and that's how I would describe it. And you probably mostly agree with that.
Sure. Yeah.
So then the question is, what problems do I have with that? That was my position for a long time. I was an I was a very enthusiastic supporter and advocate of Murray Rothbard, and I still like Murray Rothbard, but I was really enthusiastically a Rothbardian, Hoppian, in so many ways. So I think that it began to unravel for me in various steps. I'll describe the first step as the Weaverite problem. And the Weaverite problem is this. Richard Weaver was a Southern agrarian historian and social critic, rhetorician. And he, along with so many others of his generation, were Marxists in the early 20th century. And when they looked at Marxism, and this is true, I think, Marxism was just like libertarianism in a way, very deductive and rationalistic. It described things from the first principles, and the first principles of Marxism were not the same basis as libertarianism. They didn't have this property rights Lockean, like mixing your labor with raw property, some of those axioms that build up into libertarianism. Marxism obviously didn't start with those, but they still had a very rational system. And the rational conclusion of Marxist thinking was basically the collective ownership of the means of production, and that all monopolists of capital ownership, that was like the ultimate enemy for Marxists, were these ultimate capitalists. And I think that Marxists basically applied their logic very well in their own way, and I think it was disastrous, obviously, and it could never work even in theory. But the thing that Weaver pointed out was that he has this essay. He has this essay called Up from Liberalism, and he first describes his transformation out of Marxism. And what he began to realize was he was much more comfortable and he enjoyed life and living surrounded by people who did not share that ideology, but still had this like disposition and demeanor to preserve what they had inherited as a people. He rather would spend time with those who were not ideologically pure than spend time with the Marxists, who he actually couldn't stand because they were insane, right? And so that's the Weaverite problem. It began to dawn on me that, and maybe you agree with me on this, that like libertarianism has a personnel problem, that the people, like a lot of the most active participants, not like Tom Woods or anything like that, but there are a lot of people in libertarianism circles that are just obnoxious. And I began to realize that I actually wasn't interested. There was that, what was that project, the New Hampshire project, the Free State Project or whatever.
Sure. Yeah.
And I remember like telling my wife, like, man, I don't want to go live with a bunch of libertarians. Like, that sounds crazy to me. So I just began to dawn on me that like, maybe there's something special about people who are not ideologically pure, but still have a cultural uniformity that is consistent with my way of doing things. And I would rather live among those people. And if you would rather live among those people and they don't care about libertarianism, then maybe there are other aspects of political engagement that are more important than ideological purity and conformity. And that was kind of the Weaverite problem. Now, that doesn't disprove libertarianism. It just made me rethink where my priorities were. So maybe that's a good start for a conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't have a whole lot of disagreement with that, to be honest.
Sure.
I mean, one of the weaknesses of libertarianism, I think, that sort of what you're describing sort of draws out, is that I think I alluded to this earlier. Libertarianism isn't enough. You could have a purely libertarian community or nation or whatever, and it could be a horrible place to live.
Mhm.
Because I actually upset a lot of libertarians. Like a month ago, I made a tweet that said I think it was just like 3 words: libertarianism needs virtue.
Mhm.
And then people lost their minds. It's just like, but like, I'm sorry. Like, I mean, a respect for property rights is the bare bottom of like what you need to have a functional society. But you can still have a pretty horrifying society if you don't have other virtues um, built on top of that and into that. I think
Yeah.
obviously we're both Christians, and I think that although I don't use the label Christian nationalist, one, because there's just a lot of people who use that don't call themselves libertarians and that ascribe for things prescribe things that I don't agree with.
Mhm.
But like just the core, like the basic question that Christian nationalists ask of like, well, I mean, if nations exist, if there's going to be groups that people are going to, you know, work together in civil society, should we not try to make that as Christian as possible? I mean, that basic premise, I think the obvious answer is yes. We should try to make society as Christian as possible. And I would say I'd probably agree with you even in terms of priority. Now, which could be confusing because like I do a podcast that's part of the Libertarian Christian Institute. So some people might, if they don't know me, think that my priority is libertarianism and not Christianity. But anyone who listens to me quickly realizes no, like more than 50% of my content is actually theology. I think now I think Christians need to have a political theology as part of their overall theology. And I think libertarianism is a useful tool in terms of incorporating human reason into that.
Mhm.
But ultimately, my primary concern is always the advancement of God's kingdom and fulfilling the Great Commission, and then making a society that comports to Christian values. I think libertarianism serves the Christian ends that I'm seeking, not the other way around, so to speak. So my priority is always Christian based, and I would rather, like, if I have friends or family or strangers I run into, I would rather preach from Romans or Galatians or the Book of John to them than from Rothbard or Mises, even though I would also encourage them to read those too. So I think
Mhm.
we probably would mostly agree with that. And also, yeah, of course, I agree that there's a lot of problems in terms of the 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 uh, the buffet of options that the world libertarians has.
Yeah.
There's good people, but
Yeah, and
it's
like I said,
there's a steep. You have like the Tom Woods and the Mises Institute types, and then there's a really big drop after that.
yeah, yeah. So, and like I said, like that doesn't disprove libertarianism, but it kind of
Right.
kicked off something in me, you know. So then there's like then there's the three pillars of my I would describe, because like look at the title of our conversation here. Why are some Christians rejecting libertarianism? Well, let me describe that phenomenon from the perspective of those who would call themselves post-libertarians, and a lot of them are Christians. Not all of them are Christians, but there are some who are coming out of libertarianism because they are struggling with how do we deal with our current cultural and political crisis. I mean, we live under a sort of totalitarianism that I think good libertarians, and good traditionalists would both agree that totalitarianism is a much better descriptive of our system than liberalism today. So then how do we deal with that? How do we deal with that situation? And so that a lot of people, they first said that, well, libertarianism is great, but because of our emergency situation, we have to do something. We have to get engaged. We have to involve ourselves in the political process, maybe in a way that otherwise they would never have done. So they begin to involve themselves into politics just because of the state of the world, and that is an unfortunate reality that they're doing that. But there is this ethos of post-libertarianism because people don't think it's any longer applicable. It's sort of too dangerous to pursue that state of mind in a world where they're literally kidnapping children and trying to change their gender, right? So those are some of the things that people are struggling with and coming to terms with, like how do we deal with our crisis, and how does that relate to the perfect application of our libertarian principles. And so then another example would be, and I don't know how you feel about this one, but like immigration. So a lot of people are like, well, in a perfect libertarian world, you can apply the meaning of property rights and the voluntary association between peoples, and you can have immigration, and then you realize that the federal government is actually like is involved with the profound um, migration of the third world into America in a political sense. It's like the weaponization of immigration. And Murray Rothbard talks about this in the 90s. He talks about the fact that
Nations by consent. Yeah.
nations by consent, and like the sort of the like I call it like there's a good book, it has a great, I haven't read the book, but it has a great name. It's like the what is it, weapons of mass migration. That's what it is, weapons of mass migration. These are political phenomena. They're not voluntary individuals deciding to come into and enter into a contract with another individuals. These are political phenomena. They're driven by politics, and so therefore is it appropriate to use politics to confront those situations. So these are things that post-libertarians have to deal with, because we're not living in the 19th century. We're not even living in the 20th century. We are living in a completely new world that has been upended even since since 9/11. And so these are things that people are having to deal with. So then I broke all this down in a very theoretical way in an essay that I wrote for an anthology that Paul Gotfried put out 2 years ago now. The anthology, I think it's just called the Paleoconservative Anthology. And I wrote this essay called The Triumph of the Political. And unfortunately, it's one of those academic books, and it's impossible to afford it. But I have good chunks of it on my Substack. But I could just summarize that. We can go back and forth. But basically, I identify 3 specific areas where libertarians are abandoning their libertarianism because of they're having to confront their first principles. They're having to confront the very methodology on which libertarianism is built. So the three things are the concept of the political. So that's a book titled, written by Carl Schmitt, who is a German political theorist, and he's heavily influential for Paul Gotfried. So Carl Schmitt has the concept of the political. So I have the political is number 1. Number 2 is the essence of power. And the person I cite for the essence of power is James Burnham. And he looked at the Machiavellian essence of power. And I looked at whether or not libertarianism could even deal with the realities of power. And the third one was cultural hegemony. And that I looked at that through the lens of Antonio Gramsci, who was an Italian communist in the 20th century. He was a prisoner in fascist Italy. So I looked at these 3 elements and I said, these are 3 aspects of our system that libertarians, I don't think, have the tools at their disposal to really interact with the insights that these thinkers have had. Carl Schmitt, James Burnham, and Antonio Gramsci. I didn't think that libertarians were able to adequately confront them. And then I realized, in the course of my thinking in my essay, I realized that these things don't just describe the state of emergency in the post-liberal Western world, but they actually just describe political reality as part of the human experience. And it's always part of our human dynamics and the reality of politics that these 3 components need to be dealt with. And once you admit that they have to be dealt with in certain ways today, you realize that actually they always have had to be dealt with, and they've been dealt with, but libertarianism, I don't think, can adequately come to terms with them.
Yeah. No, I think this is very similar to what I remember arguments that Matt Erickson made when I've listened to him and talked to him. And yeah, if I was going to summarize it in my own words, I think the overarching theme is that libertarians don't know how to deal with the sort of like the from like a sociological perspective, the natural gravitation towards for people and humans in society uh to sort of like make power. And sort of the argument would be like libertarians imagine a scenario where they can just eliminate power, but that's not an option, that like power will always exist in one form or another. And you might be able to do some work around the edges maybe, but ultimately if you don't grab and try to take advantage of these sort of like sociological, like you know what could maybe also describe them in economic terms, but these sort of natural forces that are always at play, then the choice is either you will be calling the shots or another group is going to be.
Right.
And so
So that's
yeah.
that's the Carl Schmitt insight. So the insight that he had was basically that if you cannot transcend politics. So in the 20th century, there was like this legal school that was very influential, and it actually contributed to legal positivism in the 20th century. And libertarians are against legal positivism for sure. But you had someone like Hans Kelsen, and Hans Kelsen believed that law was like a science, and you could apply law, and if you applied it in the perfect way, you could come up with a society that basically didn't have to deal with politics because it had the perfect legal code, and it had this ability built within it to basically determine whether every action was appropriate or inappropriate, or you could justify using aggression against this type of action, and this I call it legalism, but it's sort of legalism within the realm of political theory. And what Carl Schmitt noted was that this is sort of a myth. You can't have this law that transcends politics, because politics is always overarching law, and it's always determining the definition of law and the application of law, and when the law needs to be suspended for certain reasons. And so politics is always there behind the veil, and you have to have limits on it, because there are other people that don't care about the perfect application of the law, and they could achieve power, and they could use that power to undermine what has been built up as good and wholesome in society. And so therefore
Sure.
you have to address, you can't have a vacuum. If you have a political vacuum and you attempt to put law in the place of politics, you basically create a situation. And this, one of the funniest things about Carl Schmitt is he was warning in the 1920s that if the Weimar Constitution, if it was perfectly applied, there was no defense mechanism that it had to prevent some sort of radical takeover. And he was warning about this in the 20s. And he said, if we don't do anything, if we don't determine the boundaries of our liberalism, then you're either going to get a communistic revolutionary, or you're going to get something on the right that's worse too. And I think the result of all that, their inability to put some sort of framework or some sort of boundary on what is an appropriate use of political power in Germany. If they were so committed to liberalism and this denial of political reality, they would get someone like Hitler. And I think Carl Schmitt was totally vindicated in that. And, Carl Schmitt, being a good traditionalist German, ended up joining the Nazi Party, and we could, people talk about that all the time. But I think what I got from Carl Schmitt was realizing that he was completely right, that there were decisions that could have been made in the 1920s about putting some sort of parameters on the legal system in Germany to prevent radicals from taking over. They were trying to prevent communist revolutionaries, Marxist revolutionaries, but someone like Hitler was very possible at that time, given the state of Germany. And I think that one of the great insights we have from that situation is obsession with, an open contest for power can create the situation in which somebody can come in and take it over. And the person coming in to take it over may not care about your rights. They don't care about your liberties or your way of life or anything like that. And I think that's one of the things that we've experienced in America in the 20th century, is that we were so obsessed with absolutizing some of our constitutional and Bill of Rights protections that we absolutized it. And then we have a left that took power by pretending like they were interested in liberalism. And what they did was they basically just accumulated all power unto themselves. And they spent the last 75 years basically purging anybody who otherwise would have been able to confront them. And I think that's what the left does, that it takes advantage of our liberal language and our liberal framing of things like rights, right? They weaponize things like rights in order to create their own totalitarianism. And I think that's one of the lessons of the 20th century, was that we got caught believing the rhetoric and not looking at political dynamics.
Yeah. So I guess several thoughts, I guess questions I would ask. I mean, the first question that came to mind is sort of the framing of this. Like, I feel like there's a difference between describing reality in terms of what is happening on the sociological level, even the political level, versus describing what is like morally normative.
Right.
And like, so I think now, I guess some libertarians might struggle with that, but I guess the libertarian tradition that I think I'm trying to venerate here would say that, well, libertarianism isn't saying how we would get to this perfect application of these principles or the perfect adherence to natural law, and that might not even be possible. But rather, this is just describing just in terms of uh yeah, but like moral norms of what are property rights, what are the bounds and limits of them, and and then then there's economics and things like that on top of that come into play. And I think these are just more normative descriptions of like of both moral reality. And then I think insofar as I think Austrian economics and libertarian economics is uh part of libertarianism, I would say that those are accurate descriptions of human economic reality, to a large extent. But yeah, like you can I think good liber and then the second thing is like I think people like Hoppe have dealt a lot with this, which is like, just sort of, and actually someone in the comments kind of, mentioned that Hoppe talks about this and getting libertarianism right. Like that, yeah, like we kind of like, we're not going to have libertarianism if we don't have a culture of people that like, care about libertarianism. Just like we won't have Christian, like, it's almost a truism, right? Like we wouldn't have Christian nationalism if the nation wasn't filled with a bunch of Christians. So
Mhm.
there's yeah, it's like, so I think that now I think some libertarians are just um and I don't know of a good Christian way to describe this, but some libertarians are just not connected to reality. It's the nicest way to put it, and they think that just being as philosophically consistent as possible is going to somehow transform society around them, but that's not the case. What I would say, I guess, like the pushback is sometimes I feel, and I'm not saying this is what you're saying, but sometimes I feel like this is what others who have made similar arguments have said. So you can tell me if this is your position or not and what you think of it. But sometimes I feel like certain people are saying, well, the reason we got here is because people rejected libertarianism. And I'm like, well, I don't know if that's the way I would describe it. I mean, I think you're right that people have weaponized liberalism. But I think the issue is they were able to weaponize it because, uh, because so I think the way you put it at the beginning was perfect. That I think anarcho-capitalism is the natural conclusion of libertarianism, which and libertarianism is the natural conclusion of classical liberalism. I think the problem is that although we had those in uh, the political sciences who were developing these ideas, unfortunately, the culture and the society did not evolve much past classical liberalism, and then classical liberalism basically cannibalized itself via what the left did by
Mhm.
hijacking the institutions through culture.
Mhm.
And I think what we need to do is so like again there's some common vision here I have with Christian nationalists in terms of like I think we need to learn what the left did and duplicate that. I think we need to transform culture and then retake the institutions. And so it's like we have like a new sort of like train. Like, there used to be this idea of like the libertarian train, and like you just everyone gets off at different stops. Well, right now there's like a right wing dissident train, and I'm kind of on board for the first part, but then the second part is where I'm worried about divergences because it's sometimes I feel like it's not just we need to take back culture and we need to take back institutions away from the left so that they stop trying to do all the things that you alluded to, kidnapping children and uh, you know, uh, and they're going to do far, I mean, we saw a little bit a sneak preview into what they'll do to churches during the COVID lockdowns. So if we don't do something, then it's not just going to be they're not just going to wait to do uh, religious persecution. They won't need pandemics to justify it. They'll be able to do it more often, more frequently for other sorts of reasons, in my opinion. So we need to do that. But then, like, what comes next? Because if my concern is if what comes next is, well, now we control these power structures, and so we just need to hold on to them to create our own sort of counter collectivism, our own counter, uh, sort of like thick Christian, I don't know, pre-liberalism,
Mhm.
pre-modernity, like almost go back to something older. I'm concerned that that's all that's doing is kicking the can down the road, because I feel like then we're repeating history again. I think that then in 100 years we'll find ourselves back in liberalism and find ourselves back in the same place. Whereas I would rather try something new, which is to say, hey, here's where the founding fathers got things right. Here's where they got them wrong, and so we need to make some systemic changes to make sure we go past liberalism this time.
Mhm.
Because we didn't do it. We didn't do that last time. We had liberalism for, I don't know, like 150. Yeah, I'm not. I don't have a. I'm not doing the exact math here, but a
Mhm.
little over a century, not quite two, and then really since after World War II. Although one could argue something, there were some problems around the Civil War era. The liberalism started to crack, and then it really broke open after World War II. But yeah, anyway, those were my thoughts. I'm curious what you would say to all that.
Yeah. I mean, what should be done after? I mean, that's one of the interesting things. So there was one of my favorite conservative sociologists, I guess, is Robert Nisbet, and he represents a type of conservatism that was extremely critical of what I call, what others have called before me, the managerial revolution, right? So the managerial revolution was the state in American history in the 1920s after the Great Depression in which the federal government basically centralized all power and basically delineated some of that power with very comfortable, cozy relationships with bureaucracies and corporations, and it sort of created this new managerial society where the private and public sector became very convoluted and confused, like in the old sense, confused. It kind of came together, and that was the managerial revolution. So there's this situation in the 20th century when old-fashioned conservatives and old stock classical liberals basically had really similar critiques of the 20th century. And so they can get together a lot, and that's why there are conservative and libertarian alliances, and they work very well together because they have a common enemy. So then the question is, what should be done, after that? What should be done? And one of the things that libertarians can come up with their own solutions and their own answers to that question. But one of the things that I think characterizes conservatism in the old sense, paleo-conservative, you could call it traditionalism. One of the things that really characterizes them is that there is no after. We're always in a state of um, we're always in a state of threat where there are enemies at play, there are friends at play. We always need to be dealing with situations that are constantly in flux, and this is how Western society has been for 1,000 years. And so there is no moment when we capture power, get rid of our enemies, and then we can set up something new. I think that things are always in a state of sort of fragility. That's sort of the state of human life. And so when we come to the situation where we have to talk about what comes after, I don't think that's how a conservative would think. He's always dealing with the fact that we lost our liberal world. We lost the 18th century. We lost the 19th century. The 20th century went in its own direction. We have new threats, and therefore we have new tools at our disposal to do what needs to be done to defend those whom we are allied to, and to defend those whom we love and care about and want to see their way of life justified and sanctified. And we want to see our people, in a state of, flourishing or whatever. And so I don't think in terms of how do we set up an ideal system or how do we blueprint out a good society. I don't even think in terms of like, what is the best system. I think that there's this phrase by the German historian von Ranke, I think that's his name, and he says that every age is justified in the state of God. And what that means is, like, under a state where monarchy is the norm, then monarchies can be used in good ways. And under a state where democracies are the norm, then democracies can be used in good ways. And Viktor Orban is a good example in Hungary of someone who's using democratic processes for his own people. And so there is no ideal system. There's only tools at our disposal, enemies that need to be confronted, and allies that need to be defended.
But are all the tools equal? Like, I mean, even if I was to grant your premise that God, like, listen, God and His sovereignty can work through the church to kind of like maximize the good within any era, within any system, sure. But does that mean that the Christian is just sort of like indifferent to these different systems, that like monarchy, democracy, republics, dictatorships. Like we're just kind of like, oh, whatever we get, whatever flavor state or governance we get, we just work with. Or I mean, I
Yeah,
guess push
because
back a little bit against that. I feel like there are some that seem to me more or less obviously in opposition to the church. I mean, if I lived in a communist state, it's hard for me to imagine living in a communist state and saying like, yeah, this is totally workable with Christianity. Like, because I think the problem where I think maybe one of our disagreements is my concern about the state and its in many of its various forms, many different types of centralized power, is that I feel like these are always going to be subversive to the true church, right? Not the visible church, not necessarily to Rome, not necessarily to different institutionalized churches throughout the ages, because sometimes although I want to be careful here because I sometimes cringe at the whole separation of church and state, because that's kind of been weaponized to tell Christians they shouldn't be engaged in politics, which I strongly oppose. But I do believe in the I kind of take a Kuyperian approach, like sphere sovereignty. Like I think uh, there's the sphere of the church, there's the sphere of governance or the state, civil magistrate, whatever you want to call it. And although they should interact, right, and the church should hold the governing authorities accountable to their, they've been given authority by God. They need to submit to God. But those should be separate entities. But insofar as you have certain different types of states, different types of centralized power within that sphere, they can be more or less subversive or in opposition to the goals and aims and authority of the church. And I guess that's where my concern is like, because listen, like I want to have Christian nations. I want to have Christian communities. I want like some people call me a dominionist because it's like what I say is like I want Christianity to be sort of the the moral majority, right? Like what the left has in our society today. In a lot of ways, I want that, but I want that to be us through the church. But I don't think I think that the difference is that when you try to use centralized power to do that, I think the incentives of centralized power are often aimed against that. Christianity through the church, we often promote low time preference behaviors. We produce generative lifestyles, and I think centralized power tends towards incentivizing the opposite, incentivizing high time preference behaviors and incentivizing degeneracy, incentivizing instead of creation to take and redistribute. And so, and I would say, listen, there are more or better versions of that, and but I think that some of them are going to be maybe more workable than others. We might not ever have perfect libertarianism, but some of them just seem to be like you'd have to dismiss them outright as like completely unworkable.
yeah, so that's part of it too. It's like the point of every age is justified the state of God is that we have tools at our disposal, and politics is about it's about action within the realm of possibilities. And so like people will like ask like so you're like a pro monarchist or whatever. It's like, no, because that's silly to just come up with some like ridiculous system that's so far away from our present culture that it actually has no political relevance. And so my only point is that we have to use the tools at our disposal. I'm not a neo-integralist, which try to sanctify the managerial state. I have no interest in upholding, the strength of the administrative state, but I do think that that politics and power has to be applied against. Like, let me give a good example of this. So, the plain fact of the matter is that the entire administrative state is technically under the jurisdiction of the executive branch, and the president basically is the head of the administrative state. And so therefore, like if Trump's not going to do it because he's actually got no actual will, he's got no political strength, or he doesn't run with an iron fist or anything like that. But let's say hypothetically he was the dictator that everyone says he is, right? That CNN is scared about. And let's say he goes out, he gets into power, and he starts just issuing executive order after executive order saying IRS gone, like that clip of the
Javier
Argentinian
Milei.
guy.
Yeah,
He's like gone, gone after part of education gone, right? They would call Trump a like dictator. They would call him a fascist. They would call him like all kinds of terrible names because he's brutally using power against institutions. He's
Oh,
like
they call Malay
exercising.
that. Like
What's that? Yeah.
Reason has published people who in Argentina writing hit pieces against him, calling him a right-wing Trumpian populist,
Yeah.
all the different things.
All the names. They'd call him
Yeah.
tyrant, all those things. But what he's doing is he's exercising more power than any president has ever done in history. That's a lot of power, that you have the ability to abolish with the sign of your pen an entire department within the most powerful government in world history. That's a lot of power if the president actually exercised that power. So that's the application of power against our enemies. Our enemies aren't actually like gay people out there. A lot of times those like random gay people are used as sort of proxies or pawns in like a culture war, but the state is enacting this culture war. But the true enemy are those that actually hold power. And so you have to exercise power against the administrative state. I'm not saying that we need to take over, the Food and Drug Administration and basically rule it better, like along Christian lines or something like that. But you do have to exercise power within the realm of possibilities. And the plain fact of the matter is that it is up to the chief executive in America, who is the president, to exercise ruthless power against that very administrative state. So that's the type of things that I'm talking about, is you have to exercise. And by the way, the president exercising that kind of power is completely unconstitutional, because the very department is unconstitutional. The president should have no say on whether or not the Food and Drug Administration even exists. So what I'm saying is that power has to be employed against the enemy class, which is the administrative state, and you have to utilize power to do that. And you have to look at what are our enemies doing, where are they located, and what tools do we have at our disposal to do something about it.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't have. I wouldn't have major disagreements with that. It might have, small nitpicks or disagreements around the edges, but I'm not. I don't know. I guess there's some libertarians who out there who have an aversion to wielding state power back against state power. But I don't know. I don't have a problem with that. I don't have I don't believe in the Constitution. So almost you're like I believe in using the Constitution the way the left does. It's like it's like if we have to reinterpret it to do things that get the outcomes we want, I'm not necessarily against that.
But that's the type
But
of
there's also normative ways you can use the Constitution as it's written, like the 10th Amendment, to nullify at the state and local level. And I think that sometimes a lot easier. Like I don't know how easy it is to get a Malay here in America who can just afuera all these different departments. Because even Trump isn't going to have the political will to do something like that. But I guess again, I feel like the one question I have, like to me, there seems to be a slight difference between libertarianism is this morally is this a correct morally normative philosophy in terms of describing property rights and in terms of describing natural rights and things like that, versus there are like no one knows how to best navigate the political world we're in to create the best outcomes. But I almost wonder, like, that's just a separate question that I think Christians and Christians have good faith disagreements on, and libertarians will have good faith disagreements on, and almost there's going to be a division of labor there. People are going to try different things, and uh, within the marketplace of trying to, fight back against the administrative state and ruling class as they are today.
Yeah. So then the question is, I have visitors. So then the question is like let take someone like I don't know, just some crony capitalist like Bill Gates or something, right? So he's buying up, hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of acres of land, for his own purposes, and he's maybe using them in ways that are beneficial to the left and the left wing revolutionaries in our age. And that is it appropriate for him to do those things which undermine the integrity of the state and undermine the integrity of our heritage and people? And then then you could come up with a libertarian answer to that. That's like, well, he made a lot of his money on Microsoft, which was had like billions of dollars given to it by like the CIA and other big government sponsors and stuff like that. So maybe his entire wealth is itself crony, and therefore you can apply that logic and he cannot buy this land. You come up with some libertarian answer, or you can say, actually, no, this is damaging to American culture and you have to do something about it, because this is the only thing that, like, we can sit in a debate room and we can debate whether or not it's appropriate, or we can take political action against people who are undermining our way of life. And see the once you abandon libertarianism, and once you don't think it's the appropriate methodology just in general, you're free to make some of those judgment calls. Whereas if you're still libertarian, you have to actually grapple with, the moral strings attached to it.
Yeah, I guess I just don't know if I agree that I don't know if I would describe what you're laying out as abandoning libertarianism, but I guess it's I don't think that. So this is the analogy I've often used. I know we'll have to wrap up here in a few minutes. I'll be respectful of your time, but again, like I think we put it this way. To me, libertarianism is again the moral, like you described at the beginning, the non-aggression principle. Like I don't think that as individual actors we should ever be looking at someone who is not engaged in some rights violation, violating someone's property rights, and say that it's morally normative that we should say that force should be initiated against them to achieve our desired end. And then on top of that, it's like, okay, well, we don't live in a society that operates by those rules. So then we're asking ourselves, how do we make society better? I'm not saying that you're always going to have perfect solutions that don't violate people's rights. I think some libertarians demand that. I think that they're not living in
But
reality. They're doing that, like
but
what's
you
known
have
as
to apply.
describes as living in Capistan in their head. It's like we're not living in a society like
Yeah, but you
any
still have to
rollback.
apply your principles, right? If you're a libertarian, like, you have to. If you abandon them, then what's the point of libertarianism?
Well, I can say that we're moving in a direction, right? Like, so, listen, I want to live in a society where people are not initiating force against others, where rights aren't violated, where property rights are respected. We're nowhere close to that. So imagine I'm in New Hampshire and I want to drive to Las Vegas. Well, there's no straightforward, like, there's no teleporter. I can't be in New Hampshire right now and Las Vegas tomorrow. And and then there's mountainous terrain. There's different ways to get there. There might be roadblocks, hazard, construction. Um, every moment of my route to get to Las Vegas, I will not be in Las Vegas. And so, like, someone could sort of stop me at a section in time, be like, well, you're not in Las Vegas, so clearly you don't want to go there. It's like, well, no, I want to go there, but I can't be there till I get there. And I think, like, so in the same way, like, we're not going to have the Rothbard button doesn't exist. We can't just eliminate the state, eliminate all these institutions. We can make moves that get us, traject us forward in a direction that gets us closer to that. So, like, I'm not like a political absolutist that says all or nothing in terms of, like, you know, political action. If the end goal we're aiming at, you can convince me that this is going to result in the short term or at least long term net reduction in the state, net reduction in the wielding of power by the ruling class to uh, do damage against society along both libertarian and Christian values, then I'm not in principle against that. If you can make as long as you can make the argument make sense that, hey, we're pretty sure if we do X, Y, and Z, this will move towards this outcome. This outcome might not be perfect libertarianism, but if it's going in the right direction, then I think I'm more of a right directionist than a political absolutist.
Yeah, so I think one of the things about, like, libertarianism is like the inability for libertarians to consistently apply their principles and address the crises in our time is not the reason I'm not a libertarian, right? That would actually be like a consequentialist argument. That, like libertarianism can only be a proper theory if it can be applied in an effective way or something like that. So my opposition to libertarian, we didn't even have time to get into this. My opposition to libertarianism isn't even at the end of the day, and I've talked about this, I still have to deal with the most fundamental fact of libertarianism, which is that it is immoral for an individual to initiate aggression against another individual, a property owner, basically, or, his body or his property. That's the very thing that I actually, eventually had to deal with. And the way I dealt with that was I realized I took the Hans Hermann Hoppe route, which is that understanding the dynamics of a community that pre-exists the individual. And I began to realize that all of society and all of social history in every place on earth is such that individuals are born into pre-existing arrangements, and therefore they are born within a dynamic of duties and obligations and restraints and rights and freedoms, and that there's this network, a nexus of relations and dynamics between these two constraints and liberties, and that therefore I describe myself as basically a historicist, and that rights come from history and they come from the experience of a given people. They're inherited to us by history, and they're not imputed directly to us as individuals by God, which is a Christian libertarian explanation of rights, is that every individual, by virtue of the fact that he's created by God, is imputed with these natural rights. So that's the kind of world, we didn't even have time to get into this, but that's the kind of world that I basically had to shift myself and think more as a historicist, that rights are historically laden, they're socially situated, they're inherited as you being a member of a given people that worked that out through their political and historical and social experience over hundreds of years. And one of the reasons I'm very blessed, or, my fathers were blessed to be part of the West, is that they had earned for themselves this freedom that they passed on to us. And so that's my explanation of rights, is it became more of historically laden rather than natural and universal.
Yeah. So I know we don't have time to go much further than this, although
That's
your
probably the most
yeah,
interesting part.
I
So,
know your answer very much reminds me of what Wolf said to me when we were talking, I think like a week or two ago, because he was saying
right.
a lot of the same thing, and so it's making your worldview and his is making a lot more sense to
So,
me now in terms of like I can understand where you're coming from. I think I derive rights from the Bible, so I don't know. We'll have to try
right.
to have a second follow up
Well,
conversation
yeah,
at
and
some point.
I'm open to that. But like, one of the
Yeah.
things I thought you were going to ask me if I'm a Christian nationalist, and so my answer to that is always that I'm a Christian nationalist adjacent. Like, I agree with a lot of Wolf's arguments, but there's certain reasons why I don't apply that label to myself. One of which is that I'm not a I don't think of myself as so, like a lot of libertarians and theonomists, people that basically use the Bible they use the Mosaic Law as the ultimate standard for all political societies. I don't have that mentality where there's any universal set of political and legal norms that work for all societies. I think that these things come about in a particularistic way, and they're socially situated. And this is basically how I would summarize the paleo-conservative mentality. It's very consistent with Wolf's view, but not consistent with everybody who calls himself a Christian nationalist.
It comes across to me a little bit consequentialist, and I don't know if you would reject that or not, but that's sort of what it comes across to me as a little bit like we're not saying what is right or wrong. We're looking at, well, what works in different societies at different points in time, which which I'm not even saying we should. Like, I'm always like, we should look at society and look at what works, but we should also have a purchase on what is morally normative. So I don't know. That's um well,
Yeah,
we could go on for like 3 more hours on this. So we'll have to. I'll give you the last chance to the last word here. You can kind of just give any closing thoughts you have, and then I'll kind of give my closing thoughts.
sure.
And then we'll wrap up.
Hold on. Nate, be quiet. I'm on the phone. All
How many
right.
kids do you have?
I have 4 kids, and one of them
Same.
is particularly, he's an anarchist. How's that? So,
Oh yeah, I have 4
uh,
with 1 more on the way. So right there
yeah,
with you.
yeah. So I guess, the way I would summarize it is like, I consider myself as very enthusiastic about the Rothbardians and their war on the managerial state. And I think the libertarians, especially the Rothbardians, have offered the most brilliant expositions and devastating critiques of the 20th century, I think, of anybody around. And I consider myself allies with them. There are really stupid libertarians out there. There are also very good libertarians. And I do consider them, allies in a lot of different ways. But at the end of the day, coming to terms with being a self-described reactionary or having, a pre-modern, view of the world, I do have less of an ideological and universalist aspect to my political thinking. I do think in terms of particular societies standing up for their rights that they have inherited as people. And I guess I would finish in the last 10 seconds here by just saying that I agree with one faction of the founding generation, which is that they saw themselves defending and asserting their rights as British people, as inheritors of the British tradition. And they had rights as Englishmen that the king was denying them. And I think that sort of thinking, that inherited rights, I think is a much more powerful way that makes everything more real, and it connects us with our past in a way that universalist conceptions of rights do not.
Hmm. Well, certainly this will be interesting to pick back up another time. I tend to I often wonder. This would almost be like a third conversation. Would be like it's almost historical fiction, but like what would America look like if the Anti-Federalists had won? Because that's you had asked earlier, like what would I do? Instead, and I'm like, well, what if we tried the American experiment again, but we listened to the Anti-Federalists this time. So that's where my mind goes. But C.J., this has been a lot of fun. You're clearly read, well intentioned, and well-spoken person, and I see why people said that we should have a conversation, because you're keying in on the topics that I've been keying in on, and although we don't agree, I think that we're part of a broader. This is why I said to Wolf, like this is I kind of view it as part of a broader coalition of we're against the current regime, and we're all Christians who sort of want to I think in our own ways see Christendom restored here in America, and so we're fellow travelers, and having these conversations is good to iron sharpening iron, and also see where we disagree, but then also it's good to rest on those common what we have in common, and the alliances that you kind of alluded to there, that you kind of see the Rothbardian libertarians, such as myself, as people that we're currently in a trench war with. So
and I will say
appreciate.
too, like if anyone follows me on Twitter or picks up my stuff because of our conversation, I will say I'll take opportunities to dunk on libertarians, but I don't always mean it as applied to every single person. It's sort of, it needs to be part of my brand, is to dunk on the cringe libertarians, and that's part of what I'm doing. But no offense to the good people out there.
Sure. Well, on that note, tell people where they can find you. I know you do your Chronicles Magazine Podcast, but what's the best place people can find your work if they want to check you out?
Probably just Twitter, at Contra Mordor on Twitter, and then my Substack is they're linked there, but I think it's just my full name, cjengel.substack.com. But yeah, Twitter is where I spend a lot of time and have a lot of fun, and just say whatever's on my mind without thinking.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate this, CJ. Thank you for coming on and talking. We'll definitely try to have a follow up to this, and keep pulling
Sure.
at that thread. Thank you everybody for tuning in and listening. Make sure that you are subscribed. If you're not, give this video a thumbs up, because it always helps with the algorithm. And I'm a YouTuber, so I got to say all the YouTube stuff before we sign off here. But yeah, that's all I got for you guys today. I have another episode that'll be coming out at the beginning of next week. And then we're going to be slowing down here a little bit towards the end of May, because it's my 10-year wedding anniversary coming up. So got to take a little bit of time off to go do stuff with the wife and the family to celebrate. So yeah, that's all then, just in terms of updates and what's upcoming. Thank you again, everyone, for watching. Talk to you next time.